The government is considering plans for hotel quarantine for all UK arrivals as fears grow over new COVID variants entering the country. Ministers are meeting this afternoon to decide just how far these new measures will go, although confirmation of the plan is now not expected today. Boris Johnson will lead a Downing Street news conference at 5 p.m. this afternoon. I'm joined now by Paul Charles, founder and CEO of PC Agency, Dr. Bharat Pankhania, senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter, and Jade Barker, who's currently staying in one of Australia's quarantine hotels and has just recovered from COVID. Hello to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. Paul Charles, to you first. We are waiting on a decision. We've just heard from the Scottish Deputy First Minister saying that that decision has been deferred until later on this evening for the UK. Talk us through the various options that are being considered.
Well, first of all, the government could choose to introduce hotel quarantine for everybody coming into the UK from a high-risk country, such as Brazil, such as South Africa, or even Portugal. And I think that's the minimum of what we're going to see announced in the next 24 hours. Of course, the fear is the government goes further and chooses to insist on everybody entering the UK from any destination quarantining for 10 days at their own expense, possibly £1,000, £1,500 over a 10-day stay in a hotel. And that measure in itself would be highly damaging for not just the airline sector, but the entire travel ecosphere.
Dr. Bharat Pankhania, Paul Charles there saying that this is the fear that the government will go that far with a blanket quarantine for all arrivals. From a medical point of view, what do you think needs to happen?
Well, from a public health measure, if you look at the examples of Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, they managed it well, and they managed it well by suppressing the introduction of new cases. And if we've got the energy, the desire, the means to keep people coming into the country from reintroducing infections, we should consider it. And if you have half-hearted measures, those half-hearted measures are as good as not doing it. Therefore, whilst I will make myself unpopular by saying you need to have restrictions on all people coming in, I think that is the way forward. We may not have the hotel capacity to do it, but we can use other tracking measures and other tools at our disposal to keep people out of circulation once they've entered the UK.
Jade Barker, Dr. Bharat Pankhania just cited Australia as an example of good practice. Just tell us what the situation is there and how it's affected you.
Well, in Australia, they've had mandatory hotel quarantine since April last year. Only Australian citizens and their immediate family are allowed to come into Australia at the moment. And then everyone is taken from the airport in buses, which are escorted by the police, to a designated hotel. You don't get any choice in where you stay. And then you're there for 14 days under security guard and unable to leave. There are nurses and medical professionals, as well as mental health professionals on standby to offer support. It is challenging. But I think that, as was just mentioned, it has proved very effective. So overall, there is widespread support for the measures here in Australia. And even, I would say, from people like myself who are returning to Australia from overseas who had to go through it, because we can see what's on the other side and the light at the end of the tunnel. But I do think that there are potentially better places for mandatory quarantine to take place rather than in a hotel room, particularly when you're staying for such a length of time.
What kind of suggestions would you think then would be preferable, Jade, based on your experience of what it is like?
Well, I can give you a bit of an idea of what my experience is like in here. To be honest, it has surpassed my expectations. in a lot of ways. But there, in Western Australia, where I am, there's not really any hotel quarantine facilities that have opening windows. So there's no access to fresh air for 2 weeks, which I'm sure medical professionals would agree that is very important for the well-being and mental well-being of people to have access to fresh air. I also believe that, a hotel room is not designed for people to live in for up to 2 weeks at a time, and possibly even longer. Some people have then had to stay for up to a month if they've tested positive. I have to do my dishes in the sink in my bathroom. There's nowhere to do laundry. There's no cooking facilities. I have been able to cope with all of this fine. I've been able to keep myself occupied. I've rented an exercise bike. I'm trying to keep active. But there is a lot of other people that, first of all, find the cost prohibitive. Second of all, they're perhaps in hotel quarantine with young children and are facing all sorts of challenges. So I would say facilities which, like a self-service department, for example, would be much more appropriate.
Dr. Bharat Pankhania, just looking at some of the public health issues that Jade has raised from her experience, the level of support that is needed, medical, mental health support, that lack of availability of fresh air for 14 days, this is not an easy option for people to take, is it?
No, it's very difficult, and I feel very sorry for people who are basically, in inverted commas, in prison in their rooms for 14 days. And we need to think this carefully about how we support the people. Having said all that, it doesn't mean that you don't do it. You've got to consider all possible options. And one of the possible options, for example, is you can be in places far away from the hotel rooms. In other words, back in your homes or similar places, provided you are tracked. The weakest link here is when we give people the leeway to go home, stay at home and be good, people often break the law. And that is when infections are introduced into the country. So if you take measures to prevent that weakest link from happening, it is a way forward. There are many solutions to this.
So tougher enforcement of the quarantine in the first place. Dr. Bharat Pankhania. Paul Charles, if you look at some of the front pages of the papers today, pretty much writing off foreign holidays for 2021. In terms of the timeframes, of course, we don't know that. There are many unanswered questions. But what are you anticipating?
Well, this is the fear that, in fact, the UK, which I don't think is like Australia, it's far more interconnected to the rest of Europe and its near neighbours. That's why many people have chosen to live and work here. But the fear is the UK itself could be locked down for as long as Australia in terms of people coming into the country and having to quarantine. Let's not forget, we wouldn't be in this position if the government had put in place effective enforcement of quarantine at home. It only changed the rules itself last week, forcing everybody to quarantine for up to 10 days in their own homes. I don't understand why the government doesn't look at that measure, which it only introduced a few days ago, and say, well, let's give it time to work. Because my understanding is it is working. It is preventing some people from coming into the UK who have taken the negative test they need to do before they fly. But if the government was effective at quarantine enforcement, then we could actually have everybody at home, which would be far more palatable. Nobody is denying that strains have to be kept and new variants have to be kept out of the UK at the moment. And there is a window now for the government to introduce such measures. But hotel quarantine is the wrong approach when you could effectively enforce quarantine at home and introduce much tougher fines.
And what about the costs, though? If hotel quarantine does go ahead, Paul Charles, what kind of costs are we talking about and who should pay?
Well, the government is going to say that you as a passenger should be paying, and the cost would be pretty well, say, £100 a night, £150 a night, depending on where you're staying. There's no indication yet whether you're going to be allowed to stay at the Ritz or the Mandarin Oriental or a top luxury London hotel. It's more likely to be a Best Western or something maybe 2-3 star. So as Jane's been saying, imagine staying in that for 10 days or so. It's going to be tough for anybody doing it. And this is why I suspect the government is taking longer than expected to put these measures in place and announce them. They're struggling themselves to make sense and logic of it.
Jade, in Australia, is it up to you to foot the bill, and how much does it cost? What do you get for that money?
Yes, it is. It varies state to state and slightly, but here in Western Australia, it's just over 2,500 Australian dollars for one person. Um, I think the biggest issue in Australia, which is part and parcel of the hotel quarantine, is that the government here has said that they need to limit the amount of people arriving in the country because of trying to manage and maintain people in these facilities. And that's caused a huge domino effect of repercussions for Australians abroad. And there are tens of thousands of people, many in the UK and all around the world, who are desperately trying to get back to Australia but can't because airlines have cancelled flights. They're only taking people in business class or first class. So when you start to add together all the expenses of the cost of returning to Australia, it's not just the hotel quarantine stay itself. It's usually a very expensive flight to get here. You need to, if you want to make it a bit more comfortable, there's a lot of things that I purchased. For example, for my hotel room, I hired an exercise bike as well. I estimate all in, I probably have spent about the equivalent of £7,000 for to come back to Australia.
And how long have you got left, Jade?
Tomorrow is the halfway mark.
OK, I thought you were going to say, with that smile on your face, I thought you were going to say that was the end. The end was in sight. Halfway, though, is still better than nothing. Dr. Bharat Pankhania, in terms of the options the government considering this afternoon, would you want to see a full blanket quarantine for all arrivals into the UK? Do you think there is a possibility of a more targeted approach that wouldn't, as Paul has described, inflict such grave damage on the travel sector?
I think if we are serious about it, we cannot sit here and say Brazil is a high-risk country, so I'm going to target Brazil, and I won't target, let's pick a country, Botswana. That it doesn't work like that, because what happens in Brazil will happen in Botswana, which will be brought to the UK. What we do need is good, strict, universal quarantine measures for people coming in. And I don't think hotels is the answer, but we need to send them home under controlled measures and keep them home. And we need to think outside of the box of how we achieve this. There has to be ways, and we need to talk to logistics and intelligence communities and others about enforcement and sanctions if you break those enforcements. It can be done. We have to consider it.
Dr. Bharat Pankhania, Paul Charles and Jade Barker, thank you very much indeed. And Jade, we hope the next week or so passes as quickly as possible for you.
Thank you.